you were here in Normandy, provided some adult supervision to Mary Manley. Congratulations on your move.
Read Carl Rose column. Read Carl Rose column. He interviewed the best and the brightest, and one from Mentoring.
Yeah, Wall Street Journal.
Hey.
It's the thought that counts. Actually, Mary is an old friend of mine. She's my neighbor from New Orleans, and I said, would you do a greeting to everybody? And when Carl and Mary get together, and they were in Normandy for the D-Day celebrations, they were just saying hey to me. But they really meant it to say hi to everybody here. Thank you so much for coming. We're very, very excited to have you here and also have you as listeners. You know, I mentioned that I was in New Orleans. That's where I met Mary. That's where I met Carl. And one of the great things that I love about Carl is that he, pardon my language, he doesn't call me Turd Blossom as he does President Bush. He just calls me Kastner and just leaves it at that. I do the afternoon show on KEX. Before that, I was with the Wall Street Journal in New York. And one of the big reasons that I wanted to come back to Portland is my family is here. And as excited as I am to be here, I'm very excited to have my phone ring because my niece, Olivia, is about to arrive any moment now. And one of the big reasons I wanted to come back home, because my family's from Portland, is to be here for all the births and all of this stuff with, you know, school, graduations and things like that. It's been so much fun being back here, and especially being able to, here on KEX, bring in some of my experience that was not necessarily Portland-based. I'm still going through therapy, not being allowed to be on the Ramblin' Rod show when I was a child. My dad never explained what the problem was. There was a show, Mr. Wizard, you remember him back in the day? Wasn't able to go on that show either, but still I don't hold it against my parents. I came from the Wall Street Journal in New York, did a radio show that actually was on KEX just before Michael Berry replaced me. But again, Michael's a great guy, not bitter at all. And one of the exciting experiences that I had that I wanted to share just a little bit with you, because everybody's always talking about Ronald Reagan. And one of the experiences in my life that I was very, very blessed to do is to be a reporter in the Reagan White House. I was just 21 years old. I had absolutely no business being on the White House lawn at 21 because you don't know anything at 21. But I wasn't about to turn it down. And one of the things that I learned from Paul Lindman talking, because he gets up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and so I never see him. And it turns out that one of his big inspirations when he was first starting off and trying to decide whether or not he was going to get into broadcasting was his mom. My first agent was Juanita Kastner. And when I was a kid starting in radio, I was absolutely terrified of being in front of the microphone. And I called her up and I said, I just can't do this. And she said, no, you can do it. It's not a problem. I said, the record's spinning around. Who's Loretta Lynn? She goes, oh God, it's Loretta Lynn. I don't know if this is gonna go good. Look, you can just go do this for an hour or so, you'll be fine. If not, you can come on home, no problem. 3 years later, she gave me some other advice, and she said, as you are walking up the White House driveway, you're 21 years old, don't you ever forget how blessed you are to be a witness to history. And I was. And I was in the best White House. Forget politics for 2 seconds. That was the best White House, period, the end. I'm not much for majesty, but there's a certain amount of that's the people's house. And President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan restored that respect, that power. And I felt it about 20 minutes after I first walked in. I'm just like, okay, there's no Loretta Lynn, so I can handle this. This is not going to be a big deal. It's just the president. And so they marched us in, and there was the President of the United States. And I'll never forget that moment. One of the things I learned was that he's tall as anything, and man, did that guy dress. Do you remember that? Just insane suits. You also might remember after he got shot, one of his big worries wasn't necessarily dying. That suit was brand new that Hinckley shot up that day. He was like, do you have to cut it? By the way, are you all Republicans? Yes, we are. But do you have to cut the suit? Well, I learned that it wasn't necessarily all President Reagan who dressed that way. Every Friday afternoon or Saturday morning, they'd go to Camp David. Now, I know everybody, depending on who the president is, the lefties like to attack President Bush because he goes on a vacation, and folks on the right want to complain about a president, you know, Obama goes off on vacation. I want my president, he's got a finger on a button, to be arrested. So anytime the president and Mrs. Reagan would decide they're going to go off to Camp David on the weekend, I'm all for it. I'll tell you about his little tricks that he did in a second about that, but I want to talk about his clothes. So I'm sitting there thinking, this guy is styling Savile Row suits, impeccably tailored. It was awesome. And then one Saturday I walked out there. I mean, I wasn't alone, there were other reporters and cameramen, and a lot of Secret Service. And he is wearing a plaid jacket, a bright red Izod shirt, and like striped pants. And I don't even know what those shoes were he was wearing. And Larry Speaks, his press secretary, was standing right next to us, and I said, Mrs. Reagan's out of town, isn't she? He goes, yeah. She's visiting family. It wasn't him. It wasn't him. One of the other things he used to do too, now I know a lot of people didn't like Sam Donaldson, but I loved him because he got news constantly. You remember he'd always yell, Mr. President! Matter of fact, I think that was the name of his book. Yeah. And what he did was he was able to get President Reagan. He knew him. You need to know the psychology of the president that you're covering. He knew President Reagan inside and out. And he knew how to ask a question that the president couldn't stop. And he had to answer it. Mrs. Reagan would like grab hold of his arm. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. And he would just grab him every time. So finally what the president did was he would do, there's two things. And you would actually see him in the video. I don't have time, I can't hear you. And what they would do is they would turn up the engines on the helicopter so the president couldn't hear. And that was one of the tricks that he used. One of the other things that happened in the Rose Garden, and I hope I'm not being indelicate, I'll try and be as professional as possible. We like to have a good time while we were there. It's very serious. I was a witness to the most amazing history. Andre Gromyko, I was the pool reporter that day. That guy was involved in almost killing all of us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet I'm the reporter, I'm 21 years old, here comes Andre Gromyko, and I'm supposed to ask him a question, and I realized at 21, how's it hanging was probably not a proper question to ask, you know, the foreign minister of Russia. I don't remember what I asked him that day, but I just remembered it was so impactful. Just a short time after that, I was going to say we're in the backyard. We're in the south lawn of the White House, or the backyard of the People's House, and they brought in the Lipizzaner Stallions, which was really cool. It wasn't exactly the lead story of the day, but that was my story. We were still, you know, we're still in the middle of the Cold War, but we're there covering horses. And so you got the back of the White House is here. You got, you know, the Rose Garden over here. President and Mrs. Reagan facing out that way. The horses are facing this way, and the press is over here on the right. So all the President and Mrs. Reagan are seeing are the front of the horses. We're seeing the side of the horses. Horses are animals. Yeah. They're just gonna do what they do. There's no decorum involved. They didn't know they were at the White House. And by the way, you can check this, it's on YouTube. As the president was talking, he would say things like, well, I don't want to go on too long. Right at that point, the horses, let's just say, showed us that they were very excited to be there. And it got worse, and the president would say something more, and the president and the horses were even more excited. And finally, Mrs. Reagan turned over and glared at us, and so we were trying to tell Larry Speaks, the press secretary, get the First Lady over here. And she saw that the horses that I think the Prime Minister or the President or something of Austria was giving us were actually happy to see us. Being in the Reagan White House taught me a heck of a lot, especially as a young reporter. There are a lot of people who think that you have a particular political bent, and there are some people who did, but some of the people who were called, you know, raging liberals that were reporting at the time, Britt Hume from Fox News, not liberal. Chris Wallace, a jerk, but not a liberal, from Fox News. Oh, he has his moments. And that was one of the things, too, that I tried to do, is not show any kind of political spin, to give the President of the United States the chance to get out his message, but also call him on his stuff when he did something. And that's something that I think we did every single day.
Yeah.
But also allow him to be himself. Do you all remember the very beginning, and people, well, they got mad that we ran this. President Reagan was an old broadcaster, Dutch Reagan.
Yeah.
And he brought back the fireside radio chats on Saturday morning. That's why presidents still do them right now. Now, I was at the White House Saturday morning, and I don't remember if the president was there in the Oval Office or if maybe he was doing the broadcast from Camp David. But they're trying out the microphones. President Reagan said, "Test, test. We begin bombing the Soviet Union in 5 minutes," and then burst out laughing. We're on the floor. Did we broadcast it? Of course we did. Of course, and people, the press people were in his office were so mad that we did that. One of the things I loved about that man, there was nothing phony about him. He could get up here in front of y'all and not be worried that one of y'all had an iPhone, which we didn't have back then. We just had pagers. He didn't put on a front. He didn't say one thing to you and say something to somebody else. He was real, very real. And again, politics aside, that's one of the things I loved about him. I've got pictures with him from Christmas parties. He let my parents come in and watch a departure of the helicopter going off to Camp David. We got a tour of the Oval Office. He was real. And when people start talking about, I'm a Reagan conservative, or in the words of Ronald Reagan, I don't believe it out of any candidate who stands up there and says it. Because one of the things we don't have anymore that we had with him, and I say this to liberals and I say this to conservatives, we don't have real anymore. There was nothing phony about him. When he said he was going to bomb Muammar Gaddafi, he bombed him. And one of the proudest moments I still have as an American, do you remember the Achille Lauro? That ship that was hijacked by terrorists? They put a bullet in the back of the head of Leon Klinghoffer, an American who was in a wheelchair, and shoved him overboard on this cruise ship. And the president of Egypt, Mubarak, who I believe is in jail now, allowed those terrorists to get on an airplane and escape justice. I do a segment on my show called, "Oh, no, you didn't." President Reagan basically said, "Oh, no, you didn't." And he sent Navy jets to go bring that plane down. I don't mean shoot it down, but force it to land, because they were going to face justice. He was real. He made us proud to be Americans. And when we said something, it stuck, and it meant something. And I think when everybody runs around, you see these politicians all across the country standing up and saying, I'm a Reagan this or I'm a Reagan that, they need to look up another R word in the dictionary, and that's real, because that's what's missing with our politicians. We're not seeing it anymore. They're too happy to go to all those fancy restaurants in Washington, D.C. They get sucked up by the power. That was what I took away as a 21-year-old from Ronald Reagan. What is real? And I know the difference now. And that's what I bring to my show every day. Sometimes I say things that's not too popular, but it's what's in my heart. I listen to all sides, but I remember what he did. He didn't put on any phoniness. He said what was from his heart. When he went and talked to Gorbachev, all the State Department people didn't want him talking to Gorbachev all by himself. He knew that he was going to go with his instinct, his gut, and that's what I try and do every day. Thank you so much for being here. Michael Berry is backstage, and believe it or not, the first time we ever met was today. And yes, he did replace me here, and he replaced me in Baton Rouge, but really, I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter at all. Thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate it.